The base medical center at Camp Lejeune was the kind of place that smelled like antiseptic and paperwork. The floors were always clean. The fluorescent lights buzzed just below the threshold of what most people consciously registered, but not below what they felt after an hour inside. It was a functional place, built for efficiency, and designed without any particular comfort in mind, because comfort was not the mission. The mission was processing, assessment, and return to duty as quickly as the body permitted. Captain Sarah Voss had been sitting in the waiting area for 40 minutes when the intake sergeant called her name. She stood, adjusted the strap of her small bag over her left shoulder, not her right, because the right shoulder was part of why she was here, and walked to the intake desk with the measured, deliberate pace of someone managing pain carefully. She was 34 years old. She had dark red hair, cut close to regulation length, pale skin that showed the early sun damage of years spent in desert environments, and a posture that was still military straight, despite what her body was currently dealing with. She had served for 12 years. She had 2 overseas deployments to Afghanistan and 1 to Iraq. She had a record that her commanding officers described, in the particular understated language of military performance reviews, as consistently exceptional. She was here because she had submitted a request for medical evaluation of injuries sustained during her 3rd deployment, which had ended 8 months ago. The injuries had been documented in field reports and signed off by the forward medical officer on the ground. She had received initial field treatment. She had been medically evacuated following the incident that caused the worst of the damage. She had, in short, done everything that the process required her to do, and yet, in the 8 months since her return, she had found the process responding to her with a particular kind of friction that she had not expected and could not fully account for. The intake sergeant was a man in his early 30s named Corporal Dean. He had the look of someone who processed a great deal of paperwork and had learned to do it quickly. He took her name, pulled her file, and began going through it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Then he slowed down. He did not stop entirely, but the pace of his page-turning changed in a way that Sarah recognized. The shift from administrative momentum to something more careful and more doubtful. He read something. He went back and read it again. He looked at the injury classification on her claim form, and then looked at the supporting documentation, and then back at the claim form. He said, without looking up, "These injury classifications you've listed combat-related trauma." "Yes." Sarah said, "You were in a forward operating position when these occurred?" "Yes. It's in the field report, signed by Major." "I see the report," he said. He finally looked up. His expression was not hostile. It was the expression of a person who had been trained to process a certain category of information in a certain way, and was encountering something that did not fit the expected pattern. "I just need to verify some of this. The injury profile here is it's the kind of thing we typically see documented in a different way for," he stopped. Chose his words. "For personnel in forward combat roles." Sarah looked at him steadily. She understood what he was not saying. She had understood it the moment his page-turning slowed down. It was not new. It was the 4th time in 8 months that she had encountered this particular version of doubt. "I was in a forward combat role," she said. Her voice was level. "That is documented in my service record and in the field reports attached to this file." "Right," Dean said. He wrote something on the intake form. "I'm going to need to route this to the secondary review team." "It's just protocol for what?" she asked. A pause. "For claims of this injury classification, when there are questions about the circumstances." "What questions?" she asked. "The circumstances are in the file." Dean looked mildly uncomfortable. He was not a bad person. He was a person caught between a process that had been built around a set of assumptions and a situation in which those assumptions did not apply. He did not have a good answer to her question because the honest answer that the process had been built with the specific kind of soldier in mind, and she was not. That kind was not something he was going to say out loud. "It's standard procedure for secondary review when injury claims require additional verification," he said, which was technically true, and told her nothing. She took the form back. She signed where he indicated. She received her appointment for the secondary review, which was scheduled for 3 weeks later, which was 3 weeks after her initial appointment had already been delayed twice. She walked out of the medical center and across the base parking lot to her car. She sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine for a long moment. Outside the windshield, the base was doing what it always did. Vehicles passing, personnel moving between buildings, the ordinary texture of a large military installation going about its day. She thought about the field report. She thought about Major Haynes, who had signed it, and who had written in the addendum that Captain Voss had sustained her injuries while leading a defensive action under direct fire, and that her conduct during the incident had been, in his specific words, among the most composed responses to emergency field conditions he had observed in 14 years of service. She thought about whether that report was in the file Dean had been reading. She was fairly sure it was. She was less sure he had read that far. She started the car and drove back to the base housing unit, where she lived, alone, in the 2-bedroom apartment that was slightly too large for one person, but was what was available when she had arrived. She made coffee. She sat at her kitchen table with the coffee and the copy of her intake form and her service record and the stack of documentation she had been building and rebuilding for 8 months. The stack was substantial. She was thorough. She had always been thorough. It was the quality that multiple performance reviews had identified as one of her defining professional characteristics. She opened her laptop. She began composing an email to the base legal assistance office. Not angry. Not dramatic, precise and documented, the way she did everything. She wrote for 45 minutes. When she was done, she read it twice, made 2 corrections, and sent it. Then she closed the laptop, finished her coffee, and did her evening physical therapy exercises, the ones the field medic had prescribed. And the base physical therapist had continued working through the movements carefully in the small space beside her kitchen table. Her right shoulder had a range of motion limitation that the physical therapist said was consistent with shrapnel scarring in the deltoid muscle. Her left knee had been reconstructed following the blast damage from the same incident. Her hearing in her right ear was reduced by approximately 30%, which was also documented, also consistent with the reported exposure, also somehow apparently in need of secondary review. She worked through the exercises. The movements were painful in the specific, familiar way of something that had been damaged and was being carefully rebuilt. She had been doing this for 8 months. She would keep doing it. She was not angry tonight. She had been angry earlier in the 8 months. There had been a period around months 3 and 4 when the anger had been difficult to manage, when the friction of the process, layered over the physical difficulty of recovery, layered over the operational tempo of her return to base duties, had combined into something that pressed hard against the inside of her composure. She had gotten through that period. She had talked to the base chaplain twice, which she had not told anyone about, and she had talked to her closest friend from officer training, a woman named Major Linda Rowe, who was stationed in Germany, and with whom she had a standing Sunday phone call that had been, in the difficult months, genuinely necessary. Linda had said something during one of those calls that Sarah had written down and taped to the inside of her kitchen. The secondary review team met on Thursday mornings in a conference room at the back of the base medical center. The room had a rectangular table, 8 chairs, a whiteboard that had been erased so many times the surface was permanently gray, and a window that looked out onto a service road. It was not a room that had been designed for anything significant. It was a room that had been designated for a function, and the function had slowly accumulated the weight of many lives passing through it. Sarah arrived 7 minutes early, which was how she arrived everywhere. She wore her service uniform not because she was required to, but because she had decided, after 3 weeks of thinking about this appointment, that she was going to present herself in a way that made her record visible. She had her documentation folder with her, organized into 5 sections with labeled dividers, and she had brought 2 copies of everything because she had learned, in the previous 8 months, that original documents had a way of needing to be verified against themselves. The review panel had 3 members. A Navy medical officer named Commander Phillips, who was the chair. a Marine administrative officer named Lieutenant Colonel Brandt, who handled the military record components of reviews, and a civilian claims specialist named Joyce Chen, who managed the administrative paperwork. They came in 2 minutes after Sarah. Commander Phillips shook her hand and introduced the others. He was professional and neutral in the way of someone who had learned to conduct these reviews without visible judgment, which could mean many things, and which Sarah chose not to interpret until she had more information. They sat. Phillips opened his copy of her file. Brandt opened his. Chen had a tablet and was scrolling to something. Captain Voss, Phillips said, "Thank you for your patience with the scheduling. I want to be straightforward with you about the purpose of this review. Your initial claim was flagged for secondary review because the injury profile listed falls into a category that our intake process routes here for additional documentation when." He chose his words with the care of someone who had said this before and knew where the difficult parts were. When the stated circumstances require clarification relative to the documented role of the claimant, Sarah nodded once. "I understand," she said. "I'd like to address that directly, please," he said. She opened her folder to the first divider. She placed a document on the table and slid it toward Phillips. "This is my official deployment assignment order for the 3rd rotation, dated 14 months ago. It assigns me to Forward Operating Base Coast in a capacity that is explicitly designated as Forward Tactical Support, which under Marine Corps Directive February 1400, falls within the definition of active forward combat duty." She placed a second document beside the first. "This is the Field Incident Report from the date of injury, signed by Major Richard Haynes, the senior officer present. It describes the sequence of events, the nature of the threat, and the circumstances under which I sustained injuries." She placed a third document. "This is a supplemental account filed by Staff Sergeant Dominic Reyes, who was present and is named in the field report. His account is consistent with the primary report on every material point." Phillips was reading. Brandt had leaned forward. Chen was typing something. Sarah placed a fourth document. "This is the medical evacuation record from the following morning, which documents the injuries as field sustained, and which includes the field medic's initial assessment. The injury descriptions in this document are consistent with the classifications I have listed in my claim." A fifth document. "And this is the subsequent evaluation conducted at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany following evacuation, which further documents and confirms the injury profile." She folded her hands on the table. "The injuries I have claimed," she said, "are documented in 5 separate official records by 4 different people. 3 of those 4 people were present at the incident. The 4th is a facility that has no reason to misclassify." She paused. "I would like to understand what specific aspect of my claim requires further clarification." There was a silence in the conference room that was different from the administrative silence of people reading documents. It was the silence of a recalibration. Brandt was the first to speak. He was looking at the deployment order, running his finger along the text of the role designation. "Forward Tactical Support," he said slowly, more to himself than to anyone. "That's a designation I haven't seen filed under this review category before. It's usually..." He stopped. He looked at Phillips. "It's usually routed through combat support claims, not standard injury claims," Phillips said. He said it in the tone of someone identifying, in real time, where the process had gone wrong. "It was filed in standard injury because that is what the intake form designated," Sarah said. "I filed it in the category the form required. If that category was incorrect, I was not informed of that when I submitted." Phillips closed his copy of the file. He opened it again to a different section. He was quiet for almost 2 minutes. Sarah waited. "Captain Voss," he said, "I want to ask you something directly, please." She said, "In the 8 months since you returned from deployment, how many times has this claim been through some form of review or delay?" She had the number ready. "This is the 6th formal interaction. It was initially delayed twice before the intake appointment, then routed to secondary review.